All right, Shabbos, good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Shvat, Habalin Latova, Mel and Karen Ram of Toronto, with tremendous Hakaras Hatov to Hashem for all the happiness, blessing, and good He has brought into our lives. So beautiful. Our week of learning sponsor, Stephen Jordana Galaskov, Le'ilui Dishmas, Steve's grandfather, Yitzchak Hirsch Ben Meir. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshama Slav and Aliyah, their families, Ein Nechama, all those who need refuah shavim together, Kol Cholei Yisrael, Chodesh Baruch Hu Sheli Meretz Hashem, shower brachas and besoros tovos upon Am Yisrael and Eretz Yisrael. So with that, let us begin. We have a really great daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Tes 9. We left off on Ches Amud Beis, I believe at Gufa, right? Excellent. So Gufa, pretty much like in the middle, but not really in the middle, lower than the middle, because I would never leave off in the middle of Amud Beis of a day's daf, right? So about 2 lines down from the middle. Gufa, Rabbi Lazar. So we'll say if you see Tosis Kli Halach, you go up, you move your finger to the right, to the left, about 5 lines down from there. Rabbi Lazar. Gufa, Rabbi Lazar. Mincha shekamsa behechol ksheres. We'll say, remember again, we're now dissecting the brisa that we began in yesterday's daf, and some really interesting halachas ahead of us today. So Elazar says as follows: Mincha shekamsa behechol kshera. If you did kamitza for a mincha inside of the hechol, now again I will say, typically speaking, where is kamitza done? Kamitza is done in the azara, in the courtyard. Where in the courtyard? Anywhere in the courtyard. But let's say you ended up doing kamitza inside of the hechol, inside of the actual Beis Hamikdash itself. So what's the halacha? Kshera shekemasina besiluk bazichin. So we saw this in yesterday's daf. Why? Because we find this by the removal of the spoons of frankincense, of the lavona, from the shulchan alechem aparim. Remember again, going back to yesterday's daf, fascinatingly enough, the Gemara really understands that the lechem apanim is a type, or the lechem apanim is a type of mincha, given the fact that it's made from flour, and therefore it views the offering of the spoons of lavona as the kamitza. So the same way that you take the spoons of the lavona off the shulchan inside of the Beis Hamikdash itself, and again, that's done inside the mikdash. So just like, so to speak, the kamitza of the shulchan is done inside of the Beis Hamikdash. So too, again, you could do kamitza inside the Beis Hamikdash as well. Okay, so Master Rabbi Yirmiyah is the kasha, the kamatz misham, mimakom sharagle hazar omdos. Yet Rabbi Yirmiyah says, the pasuk says, he shall take the kamitza from there. Now we'll say, from there the Gemara understands from the place where the owners are standing. Now remember, assuming the owners are Yisraelim, right? Because anyone can bring a carbon mincha. So a Yisrael could, technically speaking, go into areas of the Azara, but a Yisrael cannot enter into the Heichal. So therefore, again, the pasuk seems to indicate that the kamitza is done in a place where the owner could be situated, which means it has to be the Azara, not the Heichal. Ben Beseira Omer. So again, these are all part of the question. That's the Shaila Rabbi Yirmiyah. Ben Beseira Omer. Minayin shim kamatz b'smol shiyachzav yichmos b'yamin. Supposedly just rest the brayso. Beseira says, how do you know that if you did kamitza with your left hand, which you're not supposed to do, you're supposed to do with your right hand, that you should put it back and re-kometz it, redo the kamitza with your right hand? Talmud Omar, the kamatz misham. The pasuk says you will do the kamitza from there. Mimakom shekamatz kvar, meaning sometimes you do kamitza again from the place where you already did kamitza beforehand. Ike de amri. So who moselam beforehand? So we'll say. So again. Here's the shaila, right? So the shaila is, on one hand, you had Rabbi Lazar saying that if you did kamitza inside of the Beis Hamikdash, the kamitza is effective. Then the problem is Rabbi Yirmiyah came along and Rabbi Yirmiyah said the issue is the pasuk has a kamatz misham, which seems to indicate to us that kamitza has to be done in a place where the owners could be situated. Assuming the owners are Yisraelim, because anyone can bring a carbon mincha, Yisraelim can only be in the Azara, can't be in the mikdash itself. So what's going on over here? To which the Gemara says, Ikeda Amri, humosiv la v'hu mefarik la. So others say, he asked the question, he answers it. Ikeda Amri, alternate version is, I'll explain it to you. Lo nitzucha ela lahachshir es kol ha'azara kula. The truth is, the pasuk is actually coming to teach me that the entire azara, the entire courtyard, is fit for kamitza. That's actually what's being taught over here. Why? What would I have thought otherwise? The Gemara says, Shalot Tomar Hoil va'ola kadshe kadashim u'mincha kadshe kadashim. Otherwise, I would have felt like this. Ola is kadshe kadashim, and interestingly enough, mincha is kadshe kadashim. Mali ola tunat safan, af mincha tunat safan. Just like in Ola, has to be slaughtered in the north of the Azara. So I would have thought that for mincha, the kamitza has to be done in the north of the Azara as well. Mali, the Gemara says that's not a good kamitza. And therefore, again, on both sides, the pasuk says the kamatz misham to teach us that the entire Azara is fit for kamitza. To which the Gemara says, what kind of comparison is that? Mali ola shekein kalil. Ola is different because Ola is totally consumed on the Mizbeach. Mincha is not. So maybe I would learn that Mechatos. I can learn that Mincha from Chatos. Machatos shekein mechaperes achavi krisos. No, you can't learn that Mincha from Chatos. Why? Chatos is unique in that Chatos is mechaper atones even if someone has a chayiv kares. So I'm the Asham. I'll learn out Mincha from Asham. Mali Asham shekein minei damim. Asham is different because Asham has a blood service, whereas Mincha does not. To which the Gemara says, well, if that's the case, Mikulu nami shekein minei damim. Well, if that's the case, then you can't learn out Mincha from any karban, because all karbanos, besides from Mincha, have blood services. To which the Gemara says, Ella itzrich. Rather, I will say, here's why I need the limud. Sa'adait chamina, I would have thought, Hoil uksev v'kriva ela kohen v'gisha ala mizbeach. So the pasuk says, "You shall bring it to the Kohen," and then it says, "You shall bring it near to the mizbeach, the kamat," and you do the kamitza when you are close to the mizbeach. I would have thought like this: Mahagosha b'karen diromis ma'arabis. The Bible says, just like when you bring the komet to the mizbeach, where do you bring the komets? To the southwest corner. Af kamitza nami b'karen diromis ma'arabis. So to again kamitza has to be done by the southwest corner. Kamash Malon, no. Kamash Malon, I will say that halacha l'maisa, you do not have to do kamitza by the southwest corner. Rather, where can you do kamitza? Ultimately, again, anywhere inside of the Azdara. So I will say, so bottom line, the Gemara understands is that halacha l'maisa, where should kamitza be done? Kamitza should be done anywhere in the Azara, anywhere in the courtyard. Rabbi Lazar says, yes, we all agree that ideally it should be done in the courtyard, but in the event that you did kamitza inside of the Heichal, inside of the Mikdash building itself, you are Yotzei. Why? Because the Gemara ultimately learns this out from the Lechem Aponim, from the Bazichin. Okay, that's the halacha. Gufa. Also, let's go back to Rabbi Yochanan. Shlamim. Sheshachtan behechal ksherin. Similarly, again, I will say, if you shechted shlamim inside of the heichal, ultimately, again, you are technically yotzei. Now, remember again, where would you normally shecht shlamim? In the azar, in the courtyard. But if you ended up slaughtering it inside of the heichal, ultimately, again, you're yotzei. Shnei emar v'shachat pesach oal moed. So we'll say, now this is an interesting limud. What does the pasuk say? You shall slaughter it at the entranceway of the oal moed. What's the entranceway of the Oel Moed? That's the courtyard. That's the Azara. So from here you see that ideally you shecht shlamim at the entranceway of the courtyard. So where do you get that? Therefore, if you shechted it inside, you're inside the base of Mikdash, that's your yotzei. Simple. The Gemara says, "V'lo yehei tafel chamer mina ikar," and the Azara, which is the secondary part of the Mikdash, can't be more chamer than the Heichal, which is the base of Mikdash itself, which is the primary part of the base of Mikdash. So in other words, the Gemara is saying is like this. If something is fit to be done in the Azara, then what? Certainly it's fit to be done inside of the base of Mikdash itself. Okay. To which the Gemara says, hold up, let's talk about that. Misvei. Rabbi Yehuda ben Meseira. So both say 3 lines up from the bottom, 8b. Rabbi Yehuda ben Meseira Omer. Minayin shem hikifu of the kochav mesazara shehakohanim nichnasan lahechol va'ochlin b'kadshe kadafish v'shir Menachos. So both say this is an absolutely fascinating case. How do you know? Listen to this. How do you know that if hostile Gentile nations went ahead and surrounded the Beis Hamikdash? And Rashi says over here, look at this. Last Rashi on the daf, second to last. If again our enemies surrounded the Beis Hamikdash to go to war with us, and what happened? Mipnei remachim ukishtos. And what happens? They're shooting arrows, throwing stones into the Beis Hamikdash itself. So therefore, remembering, and I will say, the courtyard of the Beis Hamikdash is an open area. So how do I know that if the Beis Hamikdash is surrounded by enemies, that and as a result, the Kohanim cannot eat the karbanos in the courtyard. They can't eat because they're exposed to danger, that they're allowed to go into the Kodesh, to the Kodesh HaKadoshim, to the Beis HaMikdash building itself, and eat karbanos and menachos there. So I'll say, is that not an incredible case? It's not fascinating. How do I know that if the Beis HaMikdash is surrounded by hostile enemies and they're shooting projectiles into the Beis HaMikdash itself, and the Kohanim cannot eat karbanos and menachos in the courtyard, that they can eat karbanos and menachos ultimately again inside of the Beis HaMikdash itself? How do I know that? Now let's say, by the way, before we go on, just appreciate the profundity of these words. Look at the words themselves. Minaim shekifun ovdei gochav mesazara, shakohanim nichnasin lehechal va'ochlin b'kadshei kadashim. So I think in these words, Chazal are also giving us a tremendous recipe for how to deal with adversity. So what do you do? What do we do as a people when at the end of the day, the Ovdei Kochavim, the nations of the world, are surrounding us and bombarding us? So what do we do? What do the Jews do? First of all, say, based on what we said before. So first of all, again, remember, it's Tafshin Pei Vav. It's 20, right? It's 2026. It's not the shtetl in Europe. So the first thing we do is we fight back. That's number one, right? That's number one. The mentality of the Jew being the perpetual victim, Baruch Hashem, Shechianu v'Kimanu v'Giyanu, has fundamentally changed. So number one, when someone oppresses the Jew, the first thing we do, Baruch Hashem, is fight back. On a ruchni level, what do we do? So the Gemara says something amazing. If you look at the Lashon, the Gemara says, Nichnasan laheichal va'ochlin mikadshei kadashim. The first thing you have to do in a time of distress is enter into the holiness and consume as much Kiddusha as you can. When you find yourself in, and this is a tremendous recipe in our own personal lives as well. When we find ourselves in the midst of adversity and difficulty and challenge, one of the ways we have to deal with that is double down on Kiddusha. Nichnasan laheichal, enter into the heichal, enter into a holy space in life, va'ochlan b'kadshei kadashim, and consume as much Kiddusha as you can. Sometimes when we encounter life adversity, there's so much that it takes just to keep our head above water that we don't have the bandwidth for any additional Kiddusha. But it is important to understand that Kiddusha is the way that we deal especially with personal life adversity. So it's raining down difficulties on the Azara of your life. Enter into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, enter into a holy space, consume as much Kiddusha as you can. Okay, but back to the actual case in the Gemara. How do I know that literally, if it's raining down projectiles, and as a result, I can't go ahead and eat, right? Kohanim can't eat karbanos, menachos in the Azara, that you could actually go into the Beis HaMikdash itself and eat. How do you know this? Talmud Lomar, Posei Tesam, the Aleph 9a, Bekodesh HaKadoshim Tochlenu. Because the Pasuk itself says, in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, you will eat it. You will eat it. So Rabbi says, so interestingly enough, the Torah itself makes a provision for consumption of sacrificial matter, even inside of the Kodesh HaKadoshim. One second. Excuse me. Why do I need a pasuk? Why do I need a pasuk for that? After all, let me just say, Leba b'chatzar or mo yochlan. Rabbi said the pasuk says you can eat it in the courtyard of the Beis Hamikdash, and as we said before, v'lo yehei tafel chamer min ha'ikar. As we just said before, Rabbi said you can make a kavachomer. Again, if you're allowed to eat karbanos inside of the Azara, so certainly, which is the tafel, this area of secondary importance, certainly you can go ahead and eat karbanos inside of the heichal, inside of the mikdash itself. Why don't we just say that? Why do you even need a pasuk? To which the Gemara says, no. Avoda the adam over b'makom rabo aminu shlo yitafal chomer min ha'ikar. So both say, I want to point out something. There's a fundamental distinction between avoda and achila. See, I both say, avoda, a person would go ahead and do avoda even in the presence of their Rebbe. So therefore, again, I both say, there you can make the kavachomer. You can say if avoda can be done, actual sacrificial service, if sacrificial service can be done in the Azara, which is the area of secondary importance, then certainly avoda can be done in the heichal, right? However, again, I both say, achila, she'in adam ochel b'makom rabo. So it's interesting. Someone is reflecting on a societal norm. people would never eat in front of their Rebbe, right? It was considered to be disrespectful to eat in the presence of your Rebbe. So achila, that a person wouldn't go ahead and eat in the presence of the Rebbe. So therefore, I will say, based on Kal V'chomer, I would not have said that just like you could eat karbanos in the Azara, you could also eat karbanos in the Heichal. I wouldn't have said that. Taiba the Kasav Kra. The reason I'm allowed to is because there's a pasuk. Ha lo Kasav Kra, lo yehi tafal mina ikar lo amrina. So we'll say, were it not for the pasuk, I would not have been a Kal V'chomer. So we'll say, isn't this interesting? So when it comes to avoda, I make a Kal V'chomer. Just like avoda can be done in the Azara, which is the area of secondary importance, it certainly can be done in the Heichal, in the Beis HaMikdash building itself, which is of primary importance. And again, going back, that is why Rabbi Yochanan said that if you shechted shlamim inside of the Beis HaMikdash, you're yotzei. Achila, consumption of sacrificial matter, I would not learn that from a Kal V'chomer. Why? Because it is counterintuitive actually to say that you could eat karbanos in the presence of your Rebbe, because eating in the presence of your Rebbe is considered to be a lack of respect. How do I know, however, that I can eat sacrificial matter inside of the Heichal? That's the pasuk. That when there is an extenuating circumstance which precludes you from eating sacrificial matter in the Azara, you can, in fact, eat it inside of the Mikdash itself. Incredible. So Itmar, the Gemara raises another case. So it's fascinating. Let's say you mixed the karban mincha outside of the walls of the Beis HaMikdash. So we'll say we're going to talk about this, about bila, the mixing of the mincha. Remember, Rabbi says, we saw in yesterday's daf, there's different types of menachos. Some menachos are just straight flours. Some menachos include oil. So obviously, again, especially when you have an oil one, you're going to do mixing. Let's say you ended up doing the mixing outside of the walls of the Beis HaMikdash, outside of the walls of the Azara. So does that impact the carbon? Rabbi Yochanan Amar Psula. Rabbi Yochanan says the carbon is pasul. Rish Lakish Amar Kshera. Rish Lakish says it's kasher. So what's going on over here? Rish Lakish Amar Kshera. Rish Lakish says it's kasher. Why? Dichsev v'yatzak aleh shemen v'nasan aleh lavona v'hadar v'hevia el b'nei Aaron HaKohanim v'kamatz. So we'll say, see, interesting. Rish Lakish says there's a progression of the pasuk. The pasuk says, you shall pour upon it the shemen, the oil. You shall put upon it the lavona, the frankincense. Then it says, you will bring it to the sons of Aaron the Kohanim, and they will do kmitza. So Reish Lakish is like this: mikmitza ve'elech mitzvahs kuhuna. We'll say, from what point in time, right? When do you need a kohen involved in the mincha? Only from kmitza and on. So the fact that Kohanim only have to get involved from kmitza and on, what does that teach me? Limaid al yitzika ubelila sheksherin bizar. So I will say, actually, interesting point over here. What do you see from here? From the fact that the Torah only mandates Kohanic involvement from Kamitza and on, what does that teach us? That teaches us that the earlier stages could even be done by a non-Kohen. So for example, the pouring in of the oil or of the lavona can even be done by a non-Kohen. Similarly, again, mixing of the mincha could also be done by a non-Kohen. So what do you see from that? The fact that pouring of oil and mixing of the mincha does not require Kohanim, pnim nami lobaya. It also does not require it to be done inside of the Beis HaMikdash itself. So we'll say, Rish Lakish has a very interesting idea. Rish Lakish says, if it doesn't need a Kohen, it also doesn't need the Beis HaMikdash. So therefore, again, since the pouring in of the oil and the mixing of the mincha could be done even by a non-Kohen, therefore that means it could be done outside of the Beis HaMikdash as well. Fascinating. Therefore, again, Rish Lakish says literally, if you mix a mincha outside of the Mikdash, the mincha is kasher. On the other hand, Rabbi Yochanan says psula. And I will say, also what this really comes down to is, really according to Rish Lakish, the real ikar avoda of the mincha is the kmitza, which is why the kmitza needs a kohen. Because it needs a kohen, it has to be done on the Beis HaMikdash. Anything before it, because it doesn't need a kohen, doesn't need the Beis HaMikdash. On the other hand, Rabbi Yochanan says that it's possible. If you do the mixing outside of the mikdash, it's possible. Why? Kevan das yasa bekli hu nehid bekuna lobaya pinim mias baya. So Rabbi said this is very interesting. On the other hand, Rabbi Yochanan says like this: look, the moment you go ahead and you put the flour into a bowl, you're putting it into a klisharis. Once you need a klisharis, a service utensil by definition requires the Beis HaMikdash even if it doesn't require a kohen. So Rabbi say a fascinating machlokes over here. You mixed a mincha outside of the walls of the Beis Hamikdash. What is the status of the mincha? Rabbi Yochanan says, pasul, because since you're using a kli sharis, by definition, if you need a kli sharis, you need the Beis Hamikdash. Reish Lakish, the only time you need a Beis Hamikdash is if the kohen has to do the avoda. And since kohen doesn't have to get involved until Kamitza, anything before Kamitza doesn't need a kohen. If it doesn't need a kohen, it doesn't need the Beis Hamikdash, and therefore mixing can be done outside of the Beis Hamikdash. Absolutely riveting. So Tanya Chavasi Rabbi Yochanan. So there is a brisa that supports Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, so again, Rabbi Yochanan was the one who said that if you do the mixing outside of the Mikdash, the mincha is pasul. So Tanya Chavasi Rabbi Yochanan, balala zar kshera, balala zar kshera. So let's listen to this. So the Brisa says, yes, a non-Kohen could do the mixing, but if you do the mixing outside of the Beis Hamikdash, it is pasul. So Rabbi says, interestingly enough, and that is how the Rambam paskins halacha l'maisa. We in fact paskin that you're right. Everything until Kamitza can be done by a non-Kohen. So ultimately, again, the putting of the ingredients in the bowl, the going ahead and the mixing, all can be done by a non-Kohen, but must be done inside of the Beis Hamikdash. And if you do the mixing outside of the Beis Hamikdash, ultimately, again, the mincha is going to be pasul. Pasul like Rabbi Yochanan. Incredible. Itmar. Let's go right there. Mincha shechasra kodem kamitza. So also we actually reference this case in yesterday's daf as well. So we'll say, so let's say again, you have a karban mincha. Now, as we pointed out before, what's the minimum amount you need for a karban mincha? Minimum amount? Isaron, right? That's the minimum amount. So we'll say, so let's say again, you have a mincha and you have an exact amount in Isaron, or whatever, however much you have. And then before Kamitza, some of the flour went missing. So now you have a deficient measure. You don't have a Kamitza anymore. What's the status of this mincha? Rabbi Yochanan says, no problem. Yavi mitoch beiso v'yimalena. Just bring more flour from your house. Just bring more flour from your house, and you're good to go. In other words, you have to replenish the missing flour. So bring some more flour, and you're good. Reish Lakish says, Lo yavi mitoch beiso v'yimalena. You do not go ahead and bring additional flour from your home to go ahead and complete it. Okay. So we'll say, so what does this mean? Rabbi Yochanan, maybe we talk based on Elana. So Rabbi Yochanan says, bring additional flour from your home and complete the measure. He says, Kmitza kavalek. Because Rabbi Yochanan says, listen, it's not a problem. Why is it not a problem? Rabbi will say, what makes the mincha? What makes the mincha? Kmitza. In other words, the identity of the karban is only concretized at the time of Kamitza. So Rabbi Yochanan says like this, it's not a problem. You don't have enough flour. Now it turns out some of the flour went missing, or maybe you got a little bit lebedig in the mixing. It can happen. Sometimes you get a little bit carried away with the mixing and you end up missing some of the flour. Rabbi says, no problem. Go home, get some more flour and just complete it. Why? Because until you do the Kamitza, the identity of the karban is not solidified and concretized. So no problem, go home, not a problem. On the other hand, Reish Lakish Amar, Lo yavi mitoch beiso v'yimalena, kedushas kli kavale. Reish Lakish says, on the other hand, that ultimately, again, Reish Lakish says that halacha l'maisa, it is the placement of the flour in the kli sharis that creates the identity of mincha. Now, boss, take a look at Rashi for just a moment. So Rashi says over here, Kamitza kavale, dechol kama de lo kamitz lo mekarya mincha. According to Rabbi Yochanan, until you've done the kamitza, it's not called a mincha. It's only called a mincha when the kamitza is done. Therefore again, v'lo mikra mincha, v'lo karina be'mina mincha, prat l'shechasr, can the farish come on, kolash. Now skip to the next Rashi. Kedushas kli kavale, b'shem karina be'mina mincha, prat l'shechasra. So Shlakish will say like this: once you place that mincha in the kli, the identity of the mincha is concretized. If some of the flour goes missing and now the mincha is deficient, the mincha is pasul. The mincha is pasul, and there's nothing more you could do to remedy it. So I will say, what's unfolding over here is something truly amazing. When is the identity of a karban mincha concretized? Right? Or when is it solidified? So Rabbi Yochanan will say, from kmitza. Reish Lakish will say, from the placement in a kli sharis. Nafkamina, practical difference will be some of the flour goes missing. The shear is deficient prior to kmitza. Rabbi Yochanan says no problem, just add in more flour. Reish Lakish says no, your mincha is pasul because ultimately again it's a deficient mincha. Okay, so the Gemara says, Reish Lakish Amar Lo Yavim Yitok Beis, so good. Eitzei Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish. So Rabbi Yochanan raised the kasha to Reish Lakish. Chaser halug. I will say now, the truth is here, we're actually switching gears for just a moment. The lug over here refers to a utensil that was a lug. A lug is a liquid measure. This is referring to the oil of the metzora. So we'll say, so let's say you have your lug of oil for the metzora, and then what happened? Some of the oil went missing. Im ad shelo yatzak, as long as you did not pour yet on the metzora, yimalenu, you could go ahead and refill it. So we'll say, what do you see from here? You see from here that whenever you have a process, the identity of the carbon or the identity of the item is concretized only at the time of the process. So for example, you have oil that you have to use for the metzora. At what point in time is that oil designated as metzora oil? At the time of the pouring. Therefore, if the measure is deficient, what do? Put more oil into the container. Rabbi Yochanan says the same will be true by mincha. When is the identity of mincha concretized? At the time of the kmitza. Some of the flour goes missing. What do? Add more in. And as long as you're adding it in before the kmitza, you are good to go. To which the Gemara says Rabbi Yochanan effectively refutes the position of Reish Lakish and Rabosai. That is how the Rambam paskins. So for our purposes, this is very important. The identity of mincha is solidified and concretized at the time of the kmitza. Therefore, if it turns out that your flour measure somehow becomes deficient prior to kmitza, no problem. Go back home, get some more flour, and you're good to go. Incredible. Let's go weiter. Itmar shirayim shechasru ben kmitza l'aktar. So we'll say now this is the follow-up case. So we'll say so now. Excuse me. Let's say I did my kmitza, Kohen did his kmitza. So now what do I have? So we'll say, so remember again, by carbon mincha, what's offered on the mizbeach? What's offered on the mizbeach? The kmitza. What happens to the rest of the mincha? What happens to the rest? It depends generally on the mincha, but for general purposes, it's consumed. Right? It's consumed by the kohanim. So we'll say, remember again, that leftover part of the mincha that you have after kmitza, that's called shirayim. That's called shirayim. So therefore, the Gemara says, shirayim shechasru ben kmitza l'aktaros. Listen to this interesting case. So now, I go ahead and I have the shirayim. Let's say the shirayim became deficient after the kmitza, but before the burning of the kmitza. Right? So again, so just to play this out over here, right? I have my carbon mincha. I went ahead and I have the full shirayim good. I did my kmitza. So now again, I have the shirayim and I have the kmitza. I haven't yet burnt the kmitza, but now part of the shirayim goes missing. What's the status of the carbon? So the Gemara says, Itmar shirayim shechasu ben kmitza l'kachtara. Rabbi Yochanan says, Maktir kometz alein. Rabbi Yochanan says, no problem. You can still burn the kmitza. You can burn the kmitza. Not a problem at all. Reish Lakish says, no. Ein maktir kometz alein. Reish Lakish says, no, you can't go ahead and burn the kmitza if the shirayim became deficient. To which the Gemara says, okay, let's analyze this. Alibud Rabbi Eliezer, koli amulo pligi. So we'll say, in accordance with Rabbi Eliezer, no one is going to go ahead and argue. And the Gemara says, keep pligi, where is the argument? Leave Rabbi Yeshua. What's Rabbi Yeshua? Here we go. This nan. Nitmu'u shiareha, nisrafu shiareha, avdu shiareha. So we'll say, here's the case. Here's the Mishnah. Let's say again, the shirayim of the mincha became tameh, or the shirayim were burnt up, incinerated, or they were lost. In other words, something happened that compromised the shirayim. What's the impact of that on the carbon? Kamidas Rabbi Eliezer ksheros, kamidos Rabbi Yoshua psula. In accordance with the position of Rabbi Eliezer, ultimately again, the carbon is still going to be kosher. Still going to be kosher, right? Ultimately, again, according to Rabbi Yoshua, ultimately it's going to be possible. And Rabbi side, interestingly enough, Rashi points out over here that this machlokes Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua is actually by karbanos in general. Now, Rabbi said this comes up all the time in karbanos. Let's say you go ahead and you shech the carbon, you have the blood, you haven't done zrika yet, but then let's say again the meat, the carbon itself is burnt, is lost. So all you have left is the blood, you have no carbon. Rabbi Eliezer says, no problem, do the zrika. Rabbi Yoshua says, no, you can't do the zrika. So the Gemara is assuming that the same machlokes that would generally apply to karbanos would also apply to menachos, right? You have the kmitza, you didn't burn it yet, you have the kmitza, but now the shirayim is lost. can you do the kamitza or not? So the Gemara Rabbi Yochanan says, yes, you can. Rish Lakish says, no, you don't. So the Gemara wants to say, the same machlokes Rabbi Yochanan Rish Lakish, the same machlokes Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua. To which the Gemara says, man de pasal, Rabbi Yoshua. So the one who says in our mincha case that you can't offer up the komets in the case where the shirayim are lost, which is Rish Lakish, he would hold like Rabbi Yoshua. Uman de machsher, but the one who says that it's kosher, he would say like this. Ad kan lo kam Rabbi Yoshua hasan elo de lo ishtayer. So remember again, in Rabbi Yoshua's case, the reason why ultimately again, Rabbi Yoshua by the case of Karban said that if there's no sacrificial meat left, you can't do the zrika. Why? Because in that case, there's literally no meat left. That's not our case. In the case of the mincha rabosai, what happened? There's still some of the shirayim left. They just became diminished. Aval hecha the shtayir afilu Rabbi Yoshua modile. In our case, remember again, the Kohen has the kamitz in hand. He's ready to offer it. Now the shirayim were diminished, which means there's still some shirayim left. Just the full amount is not there. In that case, even Rabbi Yoshua would agree that you can still continue to go ahead and offer up the kamitza, the sanya. Rabbi Yoshua says, Kol hazvachim shabatorah shinishtai mehem kizayis basar o kizayis chelev zorek hadam. So Rabbi Yoshua says like this, whenever you have a carbon, so now switching over to animal sacrifices. Whenever you have an animal sacrifice, and what happened? A carbon. And what happened? There's at least a kizayis of sacrificial meat, or a kizayis of chelev that's left. As long as you have that, you could do zrika. The Gemara says, Zorek Hadam, Kichazi Zayis Bas, or Kichazi Zayis Chelev, in a Zorek Hadam. So we'll say again, if you only have a half a kizayis of blood, of chelev, or a half a kizayis of meat. So remember again, those two half kizayisim will not combine together to form a kizayis of sacrificial matter to allow for zrika. However, uba'ola, when it comes to an ola, afilu kichati zayis basar or kichati zayis chelev, zorek adam. However, when it comes to an ola, even if it's just a half a kizayis of blood, of chelev, and a half a kizayis of meat, they will combine. We had this in Zvachim. Why? Because by an ola, everything's going to be burnt anyway. Ubemincha, lo yizrok. And by a mincha, even if the entire mincha is intact, you can't do zrika. To which the Gemara says, what? Amud Beis, mincha, ma'avidite. What do you mean zrika by mincha? There's no zrika by mincha. So Amar Papa, minchas nisachim. This is very interesting. We're talking about a mincha that accompanies a carbon. We'll say, what does this mean? This is very interesting. I would have thought, I would have thought that when a mincha accompanies a carbon, it is just like the actual carbon itself. So you'll say, let me go back for just a second. So remember again, there is, what's the rule? The rule is that in order to do zrika, the Gemara says, according to Rabbi Shmuel holds, in order to do zrika, you need some sacrificial matter that is still in existence. It could be a kazayis of meat. It could be a kazayis of chelev, but you need something. By an ola, even a half a kazayis of meat and a half a kazayis of chelev could combine. You need at least a kazayis of sacrificial matter. What's the chiddush? The chiddush is like this. What about in a case where you have a carbon and that carbon comes with an accompanying mincha? Let's say there's no sacrificial meat left, but the mincha itself is still in existence. I might have thought that that's good enough to allow for zrika. Because since the mincha is coming with the carbon, maybe the mincha should be treated like the carbon itself. And as long as the mincha is in existence, that's as if there's sacrificial matter in existence and should allow for zrika. Kamash malan, no. Kamash malan, that halacha l'maisa, the existence of the mincha without any other sacrificial matter will not allow for zrika. Okay, uman de pasal, right, and the one who holds ultimately again that it's pasal. That's Rish Lakish. Shiny hacha, it's different over here. The amrikra v'heirem akoyin min hamincha es azkarasa viktir hamizbecha. The pasuk says the kohen will go ahead and raise from the mincha. It's azkara, well, that's the mincha, that's the kmitza, and he will burn it on the mizbeach. Hamincha. Adasya lukula mincha lo yaktir. So Rish Lakish understands over here the only way to burn the kmitza is when the entire mincha is intact. Meaning even you must have the full measure of the shirayim. But if the mincha becomes deficient, then halacha l'maisa you can't do the kmitza. The other opinion, the idach, what will the other opinion say? Right, the other opinion, Rabbi Yochanan, what will he say? The idach. Shavidach min hamincha mincha shahaisa kvar shlema b'shas kmitza yaktir afagav dahashta ena shlema. Rabbi Yochanan will say, no. The mincha has to be complete. When does the mincha have to be complete? At the time of the kmitza. But once the kmitza is done, even if the shrine become deficient, it doesn't matter. So both say, so therefore, again, we're circling back to our original machlokes. I have a karban mincha, it was totally good. I did kmitza, Kohen did kmitza, and then what happens? After kmitza was done, but before the kmitza was burned, right? Remember, once the kmitza was burned, we're done. So the kmitza was taken, but before the kmitza was burned, what happens? The shirayim, the leftover of the mincha, becomes deficient. Does that impact the karban or not? Rabbi Yochanan says, no, it's not a problem. Continue to do the kmitza. Reish Lakish says, no, you can't do the kmitza. Fundamentally, I just want to point out, by the way, this is Rabbi Yochanan l'shitaso. Rabbi Yochanan holds that it is the kmitza that concretizes the identity of the karban. Therefore, again, I will say previously, right? If, let's say, in the previous case, where the mincha became deficient before the kmitza, Rabbi Yochanan say, no problem, just add in more flour. It's not a big deal. So too over here, once kmitza was done, even though it hasn't been offered, Rabbi Yochanan says, we're good. Even the shrine become deficient, not a problem. Reish Lakish says, no, it's the offering, it's the burning of the kmitza that concretizes the identity of the karban, and therefore if the shirayim become deficient before the kmitza was burned, the karban itself is actually compromised. Says Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish, Rabbi Yochanan is Kash Reish Lakish, Ad Shelo Parka, so we'll say now, the Gemara is raising a kash, or Rabbi Yochanan is raising a kash from Lechem Apanim. What does it say about Lechem Apanim? Achelo parka nifras lachma. So say, watch this. If the loaf broke, the loaf of the lechem apanim broke before it was taken off the shulchan. So on the shulchan itself it broke. What's the halacha? Pasul. The lechem, all of the bread, is going to be pasul. Ve'in maktir alav es habazichin. And you do not burn the spoons of frankincense on the mizbeach. Okay. Ve'mishe parka nifras lachma. However, again, if the bread broke after being removed from the shulchan, halechem pasul, ultimately again the bread will be pasul, but you can burn the frankincense on the mizbeach. And Rabbi Lazar says, lo parka mamish, moving the bread from the table doesn't literally mean removal. Rather, what does it mean? Elakevan sheyegiaz mana lefarik. Once the time to remove the bread has come, the bread is considered to be removed, even though it wasn't actually removed. Amrale, so he said, Hamari, whose opinion does this? We'll say first wide line, Hamari, Rabbi Eliezer, it's Rabbi Eliezer. Amrale, Ana Amina Lacha Mishnah Shlema. I'm bringing you a complete Mishnah. Va'amrit li is Rabbi Eliezer, and I'm bringing you a stam Mishnah, and you're saying ultimately again that it's Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer, and if it's Rabbi Eliezer, we'll say second wide line 9b. Rabbi Eliezer. My area nifras. Why do you have to bring a case ultimately again of where the loaf broke? Afilu saraf va'avad nami machshir. According to Eliezer, even if the loaf itself was burnt or lost, ultimately again, Eliezer would also say that it's kasher. Ishtik, he was silent. Va'amai shas, why was he silent? Le'malei tzibor shiny hoil v'ishtri tuma lagabayu ishtri nami chaseros. Maybe Rabbi said lechem upon him is different. Why is lechem apanim different? Lechem apanim is going to be different because lechem apanim is a karban tzibor. And whenever you're dealing with communal offerings, ultimately, again, communal offerings are obviously treated differently because since we already see that a communal offering itself could halacha l'maisa what? Could halacha l'maisa, I'm sorry, by tzibor, even tuma is permitted. So maybe even if the karban becomes deficient, it's permitted. What do you see from here? That when a karban becomes deficient, it is no different than a blemished karban. The Gemara says, "Ve'ein ba'al mum b'tzibor." And ultimately, again, there is no heter to offer up a blemished karban, even by a communal offering. Okay, so Rabbi say that's the end of that. Well, it's not the end. Rabbi say, but what do we do in this machlokes? Let's go back for just a second. I have a karban mincha. I took the kmitza. The kmitza has not yet been offered, but it has been separated. Then what occurs? The shirayim become deficient. What's the impact of the karban? The Rambam paskins ultimately, again, like Rabbi Yochanan, namely that you could offer up the komets. you could offer up the komets. Why? Because repeatedly we pass like Rabbi Yochanan that it is the kamitza which concretizes the identity of the karban mincha. So as long as when your kamitza was done, the mincha itself was intact and kosher, that allows you to continue the process even if the shirayim became deficient. That's how the Rambam paskins. Let's go weiter. Yosef Rapapa, the Ka'amr lahashmaisa. So Rapapa, right? Rapapa ultimately again was saying over this previous ruling, where ultimately again he was silent. Amr li Rav Yosef bar Shmuel Rapapa, Milo Askinan. Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish b'mincha Omer the tzibur who Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish not talking about, for example, the karban mincha. Sorry, the Omer, the karban Omer, which is considered to be a communal mincha offering upligi, and yet they are still arguing. Amra Malkio Tana Chada Misalta Shimchasra Kol Shu Psula. Mishmana Shimchasra Kol Shu Pasal. So it says this. Ramalkio said as follows. We have one Torah that teaches us as follows. The pasuk says Misalsa, which means from its solus is fine flour. From its flour, which teaches us that if anything is deficient, Shimchasra Kol Shu, if any amount is deficient, ultimately again the mincha is going to be pasal. Mishamna, from its oil, Shimchaser Kol Shu Pasal, that if anything is missing, ultimately again it's going to be pasal. The Tanya Idach, another brisa says, Vanoseres min ha-mincha, that which is left over from the mincha, prat le-mincha shechasrahi v'shechasra chumtza. This ultimately again comes to tell us that if a mincha is anyway deficient, or its komet is deficient, or v'shelo hiktira milavonasa klum, or ultimately again you did not offer up from the lavona. So to which the Gemara says, Trei krai bechaseres namalin. I will say, now this is interesting because the psukim seem to be redundant. Why do I need two psukim to teach me that if the karban is deficient, it's not going to be good? They seem to be teaching me the same exact thing. I understand. There can't be any deficiency. And if there is a deficiency, the karban is going to be invalid. Why do I need two karbanos to teach me the same halacha? Lav, chad lemincha shechasra kodem kmitza, v'chad l'shem shechasru kmitza. I'm sorry. Lav chad lemincha shechasra kodem kmitza, di'i mevi mi beisov yimalena in v'i lo. No, I just skipped. Sorry. Lav chad lemincha shechasra kodem kmitza. It must be that one pasuk is coming to teach me about a mincha that became deficient before kmitza, that such a mincha is going to be pasal. Bechad l'shirayim shekamtzu bein kmitza lahaktara. And one is to teach me that if the shirayim became deficient between kamitza, the taking of the kamitza of the komets, and the offering, the burning of the komets, that it's going to be possible. V'tiyufta to Rabbi Yochanan bitarvayu, and it's effectively coming to refute the position of Rabbi Yochanan. To which the Gemara says, "Lo chad lemincha shechasra kodem kamitza." One is going to teach me that if a mincha becomes deficient before kamitza, the mevi mi beisa v'yimalenu in the lo. That if the mincha becomes deficient before kmitza, then what? Bring flour from your home and finish up the requisite shear. If you did that, the mincha is going to be good, and if not, the mincha is going to be pasul. V'chad l'shirayim shechasru bein kmitza lahaktara. And one is coming to teach me about shirayim that become deficient between kmitza and the burning. The afagav demaktir komets alehen, even though you could offer up the komets. Osen shirayim asur ma'achila. Oh, so listen, I watch this. I'm suggesting the following: if after you did kamitza, the shirayim become deficient, what's the halacha? You can offer up the kamitza, but you can't eat the shirayim. So the mincha is going to be an effective karban, but because the shirayim became deficient, you can't eat the shirayim. Di'i lahu. So we asked this kasha. The different amr shirayim shechazu ben kamitza l'ktara maktir komets alein. Also shirayim mahin by machila. So it's because we literally asked this kasha. Even according to the opinion, that's Rabbi Yochanan, according to the opinion that says that if the shirayim became deficient after the kamitza was taken, but before the kamitza was burned. So right, even if you say the kamitza can be burned, are the shirayim permitted for consumption? Amraziri, Amrakra, the pasuk says, V'hano seres, right? What can you eat? You can eat the shirayim that are left over. V'lo hano seres min hano seres, but not the leftovers of the leftovers, which means the only time you're allowed to eat the shirayim is when the shirayim represent the exact amount of the leftovers minus the kamitza. But if there's leftovers of the leftovers, what does that mean? That the shirayim themselves became deficient after the taking of the kmitza, even though you could burn the komets, you can't eat the shirayim. Rabbi Yanai says, Mea mincha shahai sagva. So says, therefore, again, but we'll stop over for today. But bottom line, it turns out that we pass like Rabbi Yochanan, but there's an interesting knesh, there's an interesting caveat to it, which is, once you take that komets, the identity of the mincha is concretized. Because of that, even if the shirayim become deficient, you can still burn the kmitza. However, you cannot eat the shirayim, because since the shirayim became deficient, therefore they were compromised for consumption purposes, so you can offer the kmitza, but ultimately, again, can't eat the shirayim. Pasuk Rabbi Yochanan will say, shkoyach. Incredible. All right, Chavran Zoom, have a great day, everyone. Yes.